The one aspect of performance management programs that I actually like is the notion of a self-assessment. And not all organizations use self-assessments, but I do think it's a really valuable tool and one that shouldn't be just saved for one time a year. Because like many things, we often find ourselves caught up in the busyness of our jobs and don't necessarily take a step back or step away to reflect, to breathe, and to focus on the future. And this is why I'm such a big believer in things like retreats, or really any opportunities for leaders to just pause and focus on something other than their to-do list and email inbox. So leaders, I have some work for you today. I know, not what you were hoping for. But if you care at all about your impact as a leader, I hope you'll keep listening and engage in some self-reflection with me. The self-assessment. Likely, if you complete one, it is related to your performance goals, which are probably tied to business objectives and not necessarily tied to your actual performance as a leader. If you work for an organization where you're measured and rewarded on your leadership behaviors, then please give 3 cheers and let me know what organization that is so that I can give them a shout out. Given that most organizations do not do a leadership self-assessment, we are going to do one together. So let's get started. It's hard to believe, but the year is rapidly coming to a close. If you take a look back at the past year, you can do this on a month-by-month or even a week-by-week basis. I like to literally open up my calendar and look at all of my appointments, all of my meetings, everything I did day by day, week by week, month by month. But you choose however it works best for you. Take a look back at this past calendar year and think about what moments of your leadership are you most proud of from the year. In other words, what would you say are some leadership wins for you? Did you maybe establish a new habit or practice, such as scheduled one-on-ones, and it's really paying off for you and your team? Have you maybe started using more of a coaching style or coaching strategy with your team? Maybe you had some sort of breakthrough with one of your employees. But think about, and again, sometimes I think using the calendar is really helpful, but maybe you have a better memory than I do and you don't need the calendar's help. That's great. But think about over this past year, what leadership moments are you most proud of? Based on just you as a leader. Next, you guessed it, with the highs come the lows. So what are some moments that you would like to hit the redo button on? Maybe you had someone on your team that left the group and it really hurt and you wish that they hadn't left. Maybe you feel like you've struggled to engage some people on your team. Maybe you yourself feel like you've not been really engaged in the business or as a leader this year. Now, looking at your calendar, how much time did you spend with your team this year? And how was that time spent? Was it group meetings, one-on-one meetings? What was the context of those meetings, of the time that you spent with your team, both as groups and maybe even one-on-one individually? What was the context of those meetings? Were they focused on troubleshooting, problem solving, tactical activities, project status update meetings? My favorite, if you can tell by my tone of voice. But how did you spend that time? And how much of that time was spent on developing your employees, talking to them about their careers, creating opportunities for them to learn and to grow? Thinking about your leadership highs and lows for the year, where do you feel like you successfully identified and removed barriers for your team? How did you contribute to their individual success? And then how did you all do collectively on moving the organization forward? Have you been aligned with the mission of the organization? Overall, how would you say is your team performing right now? And how did they perform over the year? I know if you're engaged in a more formal performance management process, you're going to have to complete this for each individual on your team. But just think about overall, how did the team do this year? And then individually, were they each at their personal best? Something that I'm noticing more and more with teams is scope creep for positions and piling on more and more work for successful or high-performing employees. And there's been a trend of many companies reducing headcount, but not workload. And that's resulted in people having to take on more work. And I recognize the do more with less model has been around for quite some time, but I promise you, you're not going to get the best results out of your team if you stretch them to the breaking point. I would challenge you to take some time with each member of your team and find out exactly what they're working on. All the things that are on their plate, and then approximately how much time they're dedicating to each of those activities and how they're feeling about their bandwidth overall. Now, a couple points of caution here. You have to be really careful doing this because as soon as you start asking people what they're working on and how much time they're devoting to it, many people are going to assume that you're thinking of getting rid of their position. So you have to explain the why behind it. And this is an example of something that should not be an email from my perspective. This is a verbal conversation. So you could say something like, I know things have gotten extra busy over the past few months, and I want to check in with you to talk about everything you have on your plate. I want each of us on this team to evaluate what we're working on, myself included, how much time we're devoting to it, and if it's mission critical or not. So you're explaining the why. You can tee it up that way, give them time to think about their work, to analyze everything that they have on their plate, and then agree to come back together and have meetings based on it. But you definitely want to set the stage appropriately for this activity. What I find oftentimes with a lot of my clients is people are saying yes to projects out of habit, or people pleasing, or not realizing that maybe there's an option to push back or question whether they're working on the right things or not. And it could very well be true that you and others on your team might be working on something that made sense at the beginning of the year, but it doesn't make sense anymore. I had someone on my team that was great about this. Every time I asked him to work on something new, he would say to me, okay, that's great, but which of these items on my plate currently, on my to-do list currently, would you like me to deprioritize? And I would be like, what do you mean? It's all a priority. Okay, let's be honest. It's not all a priority. There is some sort of prioritization that should occur. So naturally, I would say, well, what's on your list? And he would start walking me through all the things that he was working on. And I'm embarrassed to say that there would be times where I would realize he was working on things I didn't think he was focusing on anymore. Like, oh, that was so 2 weeks ago. We're not even doing that anymore. And I had failed to tell him that. So really eye-opening for everyone to have those pulse checks, to have those status checks where you look at what are people doing, what's on their plate, how much time are they devoting to it, and is it mission critical? Is it moving the organization forward, or is it just something we've always done and people don't realize that there could be a better way, or maybe it's something that we shouldn't be doing at all? So really, really important to ask those questions. There are also a lot of people that are doing work that's very different than the job description they were hired into. And I think we need to be conscious of that because people might be doing work that no longer plays to their strengths or their skill set. And it might not be work that they enjoy doing, and they might not be very engaged because of it. So a lot of people I'm hearing say to me, this is not the job I signed up for. And so we need to have some honest conversations about this. And I've experienced this before as well. I've had situations where in order to save someone's headcount, I had to change the scope of their job, but I didn't share the reason why. I didn't say I'm doing this because we were going to get rid of you. That would be a horrible thing to say. So instead, I positioned it and really sold this story about how I was going to expand their skill set by involving them in these new activities that would round them out as employees. And the challenge with that is sometimes I was asking people to step into roles that not only were out of their comfort zone, because that's not a bad thing, but it was work that they just really didn't enjoy doing and weren't engaged in. And here I'm trying to do them a favor by saving their headcount, and they ended up getting to the point where they wanted to quit because they were so unhappy in the work that they were doing. So we have to make sure that we're aware of what people are working on. Is it the job that they were really hired into? Or do we have a situation where they have taken some sort of scope creep with their position and now they're doing work that is not what they signed up for? And then what do we do about that? As we get ready to head into the new year, we want to ensure people are working on the right things and that they're set up for success. So regardless of what your fiscal year is, the calendar year is going to be coming to an end soon. And I think it's helpful to tie off the year with people and reset with the new year that's coming. So taking some time this month to do a pulse check on how your team is doing overall, and then diving deeper into what they're working on. So asking them questions about how they're doing and how they're feeling about the work they're involved in, what their hopes for 2024 are. This is all a great way to close out the year. And additionally, I'd recommend taking some time to ask each person on your team what they'd like to focus on in the new year, not just business objective wise and the goals that they have to accomplish to move the organization forward, but where they think they can add the most value and what's important to them from a career and learning perspective. Where do they want to grow and develop? This is also a great opportunity to ask your team for feedback on how you can be an even better leader for them. And speaking of that, now let's turn the lens on you, dear leader. As objective as you can be about yourself, think about where you add the most value in your role. What is it that you do best, and how often are you getting to do that work? And is it more technically oriented, or is it more leadership, people oriented? And the reason I ask that question is that many of us assign our value to the results of what we're able to produce. And as you move higher and higher through the leadership ranks, you're no longer an individual contributor, and you're having to get results through other people, through your team. Your success is dependent on your team's success, not just your individual contributions. And some leaders have a really hard time with that transition. And so they try to hang on to the more technical aspects of their job. Maybe that's their comfort zone. Maybe that's where they feel they can add the most value. But think about it. If you're in a people leadership role, your number one priority should be your people. It should be focused on successfully leading those people, figuring out how to enable their success. And this is why I asked earlier, where are you spending your time? Because if you're doing more of an individual contributor job and less on actually leading other individual contributors, that's something to be aware of. Where are you adding the most value? Some companies allow employees to evaluate their boss through the performance management process, but most don't. So I'll ask you this question. If your employees were to give you a performance rating on your leadership, how would they rate you? Seriously, take a step back and think about this. And whatever you come up with, how do you know that that's truly how they feel? How can you validate this? And the reason I ask that question is because nary a day goes by that I don't hear from someone telling me how horrendous their boss is, to the point of it causing them mental health problems and that they're on the verge of quitting. And I always think to myself, I bet their boss has no idea that they have this impact on them. Because most leaders I know do not have a desire to ruin their employees' lives. So we have a disconnect here. Because we have people saying how horrible this leadership situation is. And I guarantee if I interviewed those leaders and talked to them, they'd probably say, overall, they're doing a pretty good job. And overall, their team's probably pretty happy with them. Disconnect. Just as a side note, a really valuable way to learn about how others perceive you is to engage in a 360 feedback survey. Because even if you ask people how you're doing directly, they may not be fully honest with you. Think about it. You're still in a position of power over them, and they may not feel safe saying something that they feel can be used against them. So think about, honestly, what your team would say about you, and then how do you validate the feedback they would give you as a leader? And the last question I'll ask you is, what are your strengths and how often are you getting to use them in your position? And you've heard me talk about strengths before, but research by the Gallup organization shows that if you are able to operate in your strength zone 60% or more of the time, it has a massive impact on your level of engagement in your work, the amount of performance you're able to deliver in your work, and it even flows into your overall quality of life outside of work. So I appreciate you hanging in this episode with me because I know I'm taking you to task here a little bit as leaders. But if you care at all about the impact that you have, it's important to step away from time to time and really reflect on and do some evaluation on how you are showing up simply as a leader, not all the other hats that you wear in an organization. And the reason I'm telling you about this is because I do not want you to underestimate the amount of influence and impact you have as a leader. The Workforce Institute at UKG surveyed 3,400 people across 10 countries to learn about the role managers play in influencing their staffers' state of mind, and found that it is on par with a spouse or partner. The impact that a manager has in influencing their staffers' state of mind is on par with that of a spouse or a partner. And in fact, the manager's impact on their employees' mental health was greater than the impact doctors and therapists in that person's life can have, according to that study. So in fact, managers' impact on their workers' mental health has a greater impact than both doctors and therapists have in those people's lives, according to this study by UKG. So again, massive influence and impact that you have as a leader on your team. And that's why this matters. And that's why I hope you'll take the time to do a little bit of a self-assessment, self-evaluation, and set goals for yourself on how you can show up even better in 2024 as a leader.